I want to leave some time at the back end for some reflection. Hey, what's up, Kevin? Um, for for just looking back at the last 6 weeks. Well, I guess it's been 7 weeks in time, 6 weeks in reading. So I do want to get started today. So you'll forgive me if we sort of fly into this. But first of all, thank you all for making time again in the middle of your day to join in. And I wanted to start by sharing a story, and then just offering something to you all as a group. Um, Two things happened to me last week simultaneously that I didn't quite appreciate how they were going to line up. One of which was I had the opportunity to go outside and to play in a little bit of a hockey game for the first time in a long time. Just roller, just threw on the skates and was goofing around and all that kind of stuff. And for those of you who don't know, I'm in love with hockey. I've been a hockey fan since I was a kid. Makes it hard around here in Maryland, but nevertheless, anytime I can put on some skates and put a stick in my hand, I enjoy that very much. And I'm still a good skater. But as I was playing this game, I realized that these guys were in a lot better shape than I was. I kind of walked in and was like, yeah, I'm going to be fine. This is all going to be good. And we were playing on a fairly large surface. And so I was of the opinion that I was going to be fine, and then discovered that I was really struggling to play any kind of defense whatsoever. And so I kept having to dig the puck out of my own net, which takes away a lot of the fun of playing hockey. It's more fun to put it in the other guy's net, let me assure you. But it was a joy to do it nevertheless. I just realized I had a lot. If I want to keep playing, which I'd love to after COVID finally lifts, I have a lot to work on. And this coincided with last week's study. For those of you who weren't on this, just cover your ears. You don't need to hear this story. But I have so enjoyed our time together, and I felt like I really was struggling with last week's reading and leading that discussion. And so as I settle into a more regular rhythm here at St. Mary's of what you might call a more classical pastorate, it felt very much like this hockey game, that I understand the skills, but I'm a little rusty on some stuff. And it occurred to me after we hung up the phone last week that I hadn't led a study in 3 to 4 years, maybe longer than that, the style of which we're doing today. And so it occurred to me, wow, I remember how to do this, but I have a little bit of work I need to do in order to get better. And so I just wanted to say how grateful I am to each of you for making the time in the middle of your day over the last month and a half, 2 months, to be here. And also just to say thank you for putting up with me as I relearn some of these skills. It really has been a joy to share this work with you. If you haven't figured it out by now, I do love Wendell Berry. I have much to say about his writing, but he is really important in my own spiritual formation. And so to get to share it with each of you has been a real joy for me. So thank you so much for that. And thank you for what you have contributed back to me, putting up with the times that I've sort of stumbled over my own 2 feet as I learned to skate again as a pastor, if you'll allow me to mix those metaphors together. So before we fly into this, I wanted each of you to hear me say thank you and how much I appreciate this. And you all will always be the first group that I got to lead at St. Mary's. And so for that reason, you will always be very special. And so with that, we are going to land the plane today with the essay that maybe some of you would have begun with, because it most clearly brings the two things that we wanted to talk about at the beginning together. And it is appropriately titled God and Country. If you expected this to be overtly political, unfortunately, you were disappointed. But I also suspect that maybe there are perhaps some political undertones that we might be discussing by the time our day here is done. But it comes to us in the volume, What Are People For? And so there's not a lot of background, only that Barry wrote this book in approximately, it was the late 80s, so 87, 88, something. This essay was written in 1988. I don't know if it was published elsewhere. I just know that I became aware of it in this book. And I wouldn't say it's one of his more popular ones, but it's one that might speak to the church most clearly. And so I'm excited to discuss this one with you all. And so before we fly in, and we're going to walk through this, but before we fly in, your thoughts as you went over this, as you read it, just your initial impressions on this, just because that'll help me know where to drive this conversation today. Was this one easier or harder? Was it more challenging? Was it more in your face? More what you were expecting?
Yeah, for me, I this was my favorite one because it actually did tie, I mean, it directly tied into church and what he's thinking and all.
Awesome.
So it
Good.
was easy. This was easier for me, although there was little bits and pieces of it that weren't so easy, but the overall concept was much easier for me.
Sure. Well, good. I'm glad to hear that.
And I will admit that I did not get to read it, so I'm anxious just to hear, put it all together by listening today.
Michelle, we have talked about your schooling so much. Were you the student who like raised their hand and say, I didn't do the homework? Like, because you don't need to be that student.
Oh, well, I mean, if I just sit here like with my head in my hand, people might say, what's wrong with her today? Is she awake?
You are such a good soul.
No. Oh, well, that's debatable. No, when I was in school, I would let the teacher know, look, I didn't understand it. Can you help me with it? No, I wasn't readily with my hand. But thanks.
Sure. Other thoughts on reading today? Just your overall impressions.
I loved how precise and concise this was. I mean, in just 10 pages, he gets right to the heart of it. And I feel like, this must have been either something that he worked very hard to craft each sentence so that it was just perfectly saying what he wanted, or else it just sort of came out, in a fit of inspiration. I don't know. But I was really impressed at how direct and cutting right to the heart of it is.
I agree. I came to the end of the essay and I said, oh shoot, we're at the end. Like I felt like I was like, I think this, other than the first one we read, Agrarian Standard, which I think was intended to be short, I think this is the shortest one we've read. And yeah, like I too was surprised that I got to the end of this and wow, we've completed the argument. So yeah, it's a really well-written piece. And those of you who are writers will appreciate just sort of the skill that he shows in this.
I thought he was kind of pessimistic about the future. I thought he was critical of churches in general, because somewhere in there, I think he says that churches have done little to protect the earth against those who dishonor it, although he didn't specify who those are. And I thought he was just pessimistic. It might be a little too late to significantly make a difference to protect what we have that is naturally given to us from God.
Anybody else hear that pessimism?
I felt the same way.
Okay.
Yes, I felt the same way as Mike.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always hear his pessimism as a grumpy old farmer, and that's a tone I'm very used to.
Way to put it.
And maybe that clouds my understanding of his tone. Is that and please don't hear that as an overgeneralization. Just I saw him speak once at Hopkins, and he very much reminded me of my grandfather that I grew up with, and who owned the farm that we farmed. And so just his tone about, I don't know why we got to change everything, just felt very much like the voices that I had heard. So maybe he is more pessimistic than I hear him when I do read him.
Well, do you agree with him? And maybe I misunderstood it as that the rural church is a training ground for ministers to go somewhere else?
Oh boy, are we going to talk about that?
Okay. That's it.
I got a story about that, so don't jump ahead, okay? I have very strong feelings about that. So, well then let's fly into this, and we'll go as quickly as we can with as much thoroughness as we can. And so he begins right at the beginning of this essay with the subject of Christianity and ecology is endlessly, perhaps infinitely fascinating. Full disclosure, I happen to agree with him. Most of the interesting things that I've done in my own spirituality, my sense of call, and even in my, if you'll permit me, professional vocation, which he's going to talk about that later as well. has been around this intersection of Christianity and ecology and and of course agriculture as well. So I agree with him. But I wonder what kind of conversations in the communities of faith that you have been a part of have dealt with this intersection of faith and ecology. Have you heard it preached? Have you done work in this area? Just what's your experience with this intersection? And I know some of you have experience, so don't just sit there and be like, well, I'm not going to say anything. No, it's the last week. Now's the time.
Well, the only thing that comes to, or the biggest thing that comes to mind for me is going to conferences, and we always have, or we've often had people there talking about energy and energy conservation. And that one's always been interesting to me, and they do bring it into it in talking about, it's important for us to be saving these resources and doing cleaner energy, and how we as churches can do that. So that really came to mind for me when you just asked that question.
And what kind of conferences? Can you give us a little context about where you've been?
Which one is it that we get to?
Central.
Central Atlantic Conference.
Oh, okay,
Central.
okay.
Yeah.
So UCC or denominationally
Yeah, UCC.
affiliated?
Yeah,
Okay,
UCC
cool.
conference. Yeah.
Cool. Yep. Yeah, very good. And I know, the United Church of Christ has a lot to say about this. So other experiences around faith and ecology.
It's been a difficult one in my parish. We have a lot of people who are really interested in the concept in the abstract, but at various times when members of the church have tried to turn that into a more practical conversation, there have been some bad feelings created. We've had people, feel like once you start talking about specific things that we should do and change, then people feel attacked, and people feel like they're being shamed for the things that they're doing that aren't good enough. And so then the conversation has tended to break down.
Yeah.
And so we have now kind of a small nucleus of people trying to keep those conversations going, but it's difficult to get traction because there's a lot of this negative feeling like, oh, you're going to judge us when you tell us that, we're not caring for creation well enough or something. And it's hard to cross that boundary.
Yeah.
This is where I would like all of my time to be spent, is the interconnection between faith and ecology. And so I spend a fair amount of time in that area, and have landed in a church that I didn't expect to have a community. Unlike your experience, Kevin, I thought I was going to have to come in on a soapbox and say, okay, in the midst of this urban church, we need to do this, and this, and actually that community is already there in a lot of ways. But where we are challenged, which is so interesting about this article, is we're doing a redevelopment, and so we're very building focused, and it's really hard to remember our responsibility as environmental stewards, although we're doing lots of stuff that's really exciting, but you can get really absorbed by just the buildings. So yeah, and so that resonated, the beginning of the passage resonated. I would say in Canada, and Sam, that's one of the reasons why we've met each other over the years, is in Canada has been way behind the food and faith and the faith and ecology movement, I would say, than the US. And every time I've searched over the years, I've not been able to find anything, and have ended up doing a few fellowships and a lot of education in North Carolina.
Yeah.
because nothing's in Canada. But they're catching up. But
Yeah. Very good. Any other reflections on your experience of this intersection?
In our work in Liberia, teaching agriculture and also being a missionary, you know, I'm hearing a lot of you guys talk about how trying to get the church involved in these things. And a lot of times there, we are actually talking about agriculture and then bringing God into it. So it kind of feels like opposite, because most people are open to those conversations about agriculture. And then when we talk about stewardship and creation, then that brings the faith aspect into it afterwards. So that's just interesting hearing from the American or Canadian side as well.
That's very interesting. Well, so Barry invites us to consider those things, you know, and even for those of you who are at St. Mary's, whether this was the genesis of this or not, I mean, the garden that you have established out back is clearly a sign of engaging with these ideas, whether that was what you intended to do or not, you know. And those are the stories that, unfortunately, if it wasn't for COVID, we would have fleshed out by now, and I would have heard, you know, a little bit more of that history. But just the fact that you all have a garden, and then not to mention that, but you have, you know, all these cornfields and all these farms down Mayberry Road and all of that. Like, it sounds like this has been a regular part of your conversation. But sometimes these themes are underneath the conversation. And so I think what Barry is trying to do is elevate this and say, you know what, all of these interactions are really, really fascinating. What astounds him is that it doesn't seem to be fascinating to the church. He says, you know, like this seems very, very obvious for a group of people, and we're going to use the word church, but I think this can apply to any community of faith. So so please have some grace for me as I just use the language I am most familiar with. But any community of faith seeking to worship the Creator would have some interest in the creation. And I think he's astounded as a farmer that doesn't always seem to play itself out. And in this second paragraph, he has some scathing criticisms in my reading of it, of Christianity just not being aware of where it finds itself in the conversations we ought to be having. And that paragraph opens with, organized Christianity seems in general to have made peace with, quote, the economy by divorcing itself from economic issues. And this, I think, has proved to be a disaster, both religious and economic. So he's saying by the church removing itself from these conversations around how we do our economy or how we set our life up together, he said it has both hurt the church and it has hurt our economy. It's actually hurt our communities. And I think you can take economy from our very local economy and the way that he understands it, all the way up to maybe national and even global economies. What other criticisms do you hear him level at the church here? So this is a good time just to kind of quote some of the things that stood out to you in this passage. What are some of the real criticisms that he levels at the church, and what did you make of that criticism?
The one that I found interesting was he said that the organized church comes immediately under a compulsion to think of itself.
Does that ring true for you?
No, it doesn't.
Oh, okay. Can you say more about that?
I don't think the church necessarily thinks of itself. I mean, I don't know, I could be off base here, but I feel like
no. Please don't hear that. I just want to flesh that out, because that is a really striking thing he says. Carry on.
I just feel like, especially at St. Mary's, I mean, so much community, you know, a sense of community and give back, and, you know, like you said, with the garden and the food pantry and things like that. So I don't think at St. Mary's anyway that the church thinks of itself first.
Okay. Other criticisms leveled in this paragraph?
Maybe he's talking about the church as an institution wanting and needing to preserve itself, and therefore avoids issues that will create potential problems that could weaken or destroy the institution. Whether you have, and I'm not talking about St. Mary's at all.
Mhm.
I'm just talking about religious institutions in general. And they're all about self-preservation. And yes, they do have the gospel. Yes, they do want charity for all. And you express your love of God by caring for and sharing with your neighbor. You care for your fellow man to a certain degree. So it's the preservation of the institution to me that I think he's addressing.
I think I would agree in part to that I think, I mean, honestly, I would say I could stay on the first 4 paragraphs and say, and basically, you know, once again, Wendell Berry kicks me and says, like, go. You know, like, it's profound to me. And I think the system, just recognizing that church as an organization and as a system is interconnected with the economic, and I would say the consumerist and materialist economy makes it begin to be self preserving. We're having a huge issue at that rate now here. Like, what's it going to look like after COVID for our national system in the Anglican Church, and what's it even going to look like in the local system, and how do we grapple with the professionalization of clergy, where I think it's interesting, Christy, what you say is on the local level, we are often very outward focused. But then when you start to dig into the preservation system, it starts to get a little bit subject to what I think Wendell is bringing forward. Like, where's your limit, right? Because we are all, where's our limit? Like, what would we sacrifice? One of my big questions is what would you give up to do everything for your neighbor? And I'm talking to the church as a system, to the church as a huge property owner.
So I was struck, and just I, as a pastor, I had to sit really hard with these 2 statements that are made in that paragraph. He writes, "If it comes to a choice between the extermination of the fowls of the air and the lilies of the field and the extermination of a building fund, the organized church will elect, indeed has already elected, to save the building fund." And I had to sit with that and be like, well, first, like the first question I had to ask myself is, what would it look like to not save the building fund and to save the birds of the air? Like, I don't even have as professional clergy, I don't even have an experience of what that would look like. Like, I'm not even sure how that would happen. So it reminded me that, I, just as a clergyman, I have come up through a system that has regularly taught me how to preserve the building fund, but is asking me to figure out on my own how to preserve the birds of the air. And I don't always know how to do that. Like, I don't quite know what that would look like. And then the second thing that happened for me is he says the irony, and there is an irony around this, is compounded and made harder to bear by the fact that the building fund can be preserved by crude applications of money. And I have sat in more committee meetings than I care to think about, knowing exactly how that goes down. And everyone who knows what I'm talking about is smiling right now. So you all are telling on yourself. But he says, but the fowl of the air and the lilies of the field can be preserved only by true religion, by the practice of proper love and respect for them as creatures of God. And so, and what I heard him saying is, like, to save the building fund means enacting out of our economic principles, whereas the irony is that if we acted out of our deepest religious principles, that we would very naturally preserve preserve the birds and the wild. And again, and so my thought was, well, again, what would that, and maybe I'll offer this to you, what does he mean by true religion, and what would that look like in a local parish context? What would it look like to practice true religion as opposed to saving the building fund? And is that even a desirable thing to do? All y'all who have led in churches, now's the time.
Well, there is this, I mean, we can do, there's a lot that we can do without money, but you have to have resources to do things. So if we're not treating the church in some ways as a business where we're raising money and pushing that money back out, how do we do that? Short of, I mean, everything costs money. Food, we can grow a garden, but you got to buy the seed, and you've got to have a vehicle to transport that, I mean, particularly in a rural community. So I feel like they have to work together. In some cases, we have witnessed in other churches locally where huge sums of money were applied to the things and not to the people, and they suffered because of it. So I think there is this balance of what you do with the money. But if we don't have this infrastructure, if we don't have this created community and infrastructure, then none of the rest of it's going to be there. Mm-hmm. I feel like without the church, the business of the church, I mean, without a structural church, then it's kind of hard to pull that off. Mm-hmm. I mean, not that it doesn't happen in small little pockets here and there, but it's hard.
Sure. No, it is hard. And part of that's because the paradigms don't really exist, or our paradigms don't all, we struggle with imagination more than we struggle with execution. Like, we all kind of know how to execute our lives, and we know how to execute institutional life. It's our imagination about how we might otherwise do it that comes into play, and that's what we struggle with. We don't have the models for it. True religion. What would true religion look like?
Yeah, it's interesting because we've been doing the Tuesday Bible study, and we just wrapped that one up. And that one, the whole, I mean, really, it's about loving others. Loving others and caring for others. So what more is there? I mean, acting on that love and living a life and making decisions as we believe Jesus would have done. Mm-hmm. And being faithful.
Yeah. But that always comes out in practices. Mm-hmm. Like we talk about, and this he's actually going to get to this next, but we always talk about faithfulness apart from actual practices. And at some point and James talks about this in the Bible. He says, faith without works is dead. Like there is no reasonable division. And so that's what I'm saying. Like, what would it look like for a church to practice true religion? Certainly we can all see there are ways that we acknowledge a better way forward, but practice in less ideal ways. We're like, this is what true Christians do, but here's what we're only able to do. And I think he's calling out this gap and saying, wait a second, there's actually this space between worshiping the Creator, but then not always being thoughtful of creation. And I think he's inviting us to see the gap sometimes in institutional life that happens.
Well, I like what Vicki just said in reference to the Tuesday night study that I know her and Tommy had been attending. And, when I see this, and I just want to go back one notch because I'm kind of jumping in here, sure. It's like, I think time is a big factor in here, not only the past and the future, but in a church, in the church, not just St. Mary's, the church. It's, when you had Save the Building versus Save the Birds in the Air, it was like, it also comes with age factors in the church. I mean, you have the older generation, and I've seen it now, I'm going to say it within our church. It's like save the money. And I say this 150% respect. And you have the middle-aged generation like myself, which I can see why the older generation feels the way they do. But then we have younger families with children, which are our future coming into the church, and they want to see changes. And I just think this whole, you have the money within the church. What do you spend it on? How do you change the church? And I'm here at church, and I see this beautiful sanctuary and church that we have with all its antiquities. It's a beautiful church. If any of you have never seen the inside of it, but I'm seeing so much of our future coming in to change it, but in good ways. So I'm kind of caught in the middle.
Sure.
Which is a good thing, because I can see both sides of it. I don't always agree, but I don't always disagree by far. But it all boils down to basically, with Vicki sharing the Tuesday night study.
Yeah. And for those of you who don't know, my wife Jenny is the one leading the Tuesday night study. So if you're expecting me to throw that study under the bus in any way, shape, or form, that's not happening.
I said, we've got Jenny's back.
I know you do. That's what scares me. But and Vicki, I hear what you're saying, and as I was doing some research around this, there were some people who were like, all right, there were some people who were suggesting that in this essay, Barry is trying to say, there should be no institutionalism in church, and I think that would be a misreading. I don't think he's saying break all the institutions down, like destroy everything that is around. Like I don't think he's saying that, because my sense of Barry is that he understands that anytime humans get together, we institutionalize. Like we have to create ways of being together. And as soon as we decide we're going to be in a particular way together, however, like there's a sense in which what we've done over the last 6 weeks is an institution. Like we have ways of being. There's actually kind of a liturgy that happens. We start, we say, hey, how you doing? We talk to each other. Then we go into it. Like we cannot help but organize our lives in particular ways. It's not to say that we can do away with that. I think it's similar to how he talked about tractors in our last essay. He doesn't say get rid of tractors. He says be aware that when you introduce a tractor into the system, that it changes how you think about that system, and you need to be really thoughtful about how you use that tool inside of the ecosystem in which you find yourself. I think what he's asking us to do is to say, don't get rid of the institution, but be really critical in a positive way, a thoughtful way, about how the institution will tempt you to go in particular ways that may go directly contrary to your values. So Barry, as in his sort of prophetic self, is going to stand over and apart from the church. But I don't think he's saying blow the church up. He's saying, church, you haven't thought hard enough about the temptations that come with the way that you are tied into economic systems. I was reminded of this in seminary. A dear seminary professor of mine, he spent a lot of time studying Appalachia and did a lot of rural ministry stuff from the context of the Appalachian region. And what he said is that churches in West Virginia, Kentucky, I mean, you can imagine sort of that Appalachian stretch. He said, when the coal is good, the churches are huge. They benefited from a system that came, mountaintop removal, come in, take the top off the mountain, take all the coal out. All right, money is booming, money is flowing because of destruction, and churches grow and they get bigger. All of a sudden, the coal goes away and now the church dies. And basically, he's reminding us, live by the sword, die by the sword. And that's Jesus. And Barry's saying, if we'd have thought a little more critically about what it means to build a church on the back of a destructive economic system, we might have thought twice about the way that the church and the faithful interacted with that system that now has come out from underneath of them and has left destruction in its wake. So I think he's saying, don't blow church up, but think more carefully about how church is. Think more carefully about your virtues and your values and live into that more than living into the economies that may very well be destructive around you. That's my take on it. I'll let you reflect on that real quick before we jump into where he wants to go next. And this is where Dorothy Ellen wants to go really badly. So I want to get there.
Yeah, I just think one of our problems is how we define church. So
And
I
that's
think
always on the table,
yeah,
isn't it?
we continue to make somehow over the years, particularly I think out of the 1950s in the height of Christendom, churches, the building and the nucleus and the membership and everything else is a program.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the biggest ways it was exemplified for me was when in my rural church community, we all, they felt guilty that we had to not do anything just during the fair week. And I asked people, well, this church started the fair 150 years ago. Is the fair part of church? And they didn't, somewhere that was law.
Yeah.
The agricultural fair is the church.
Preach that.
Right? And so the building will be okay on the Sunday. Get yourself to the ring and let's be the church, welcome people,
Yeah.
Anyways, I could go on.
I am always, Steve will tell you, I'm always here for the Ag Ferris Church. I will amen that all day long.
Yeah.
And so he moves on then to make this point. He uses a word several times at the top of page 97. He uses the word desecration. Okay, and I just want to ask, just because I've learned not to assume that we all sort of understand words the same way. What does it mean to desecrate something? What is desecration?
I think of it as being destroying something,
Story, that's
to
what,
desecrate it. Is to
yeah, that's what I would say.
get rid of it.
Okay. Destruction. Other ideas about desecration?
Misuse or abuse.
Mhm, that was-
Remove the
also think
value.
yeah,
Oh.
value you said. Yeah, I also think of like sucking the life out of something.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, and so the idea of and so we could create different definitions of desecration in a variety of different contexts, but a clue to how he wants to use it is when he talks about Cartesian science. Not sure. I'm sure. I have a minor in philosophy, so when I see that, I'm like, "Ooh, we get to talk about this." But I don't want to dive too much into Rene Descartes. That he's not that interesting, but but Descartes is really influential. And Cartesian science is basically the idea that the mind is separate from the body. And what Descartes was often talking about is that we can think our way to knowledge as opposed to experiencing our way to knowledge. Yeah, and he sets himself up against some other philosophical systems. But it really is this separation of the mind and the body. And I think when he uses this notion of Cartesian science to describe desecration, I think what he's saying is taking this thing that is originally whole and separating out spirituality versus what we might call reality or real life. Is saying spirituality is something that happens over here and real life is over here, and that these two things really shouldn't talk to one another. And I think this gives some context to what he was talking about with, well, the church just deals in spirituality. It shouldn't really have this idea that the church shouldn't say anything about the economy, or that we shouldn't think about that or have anything to say about it. And this is where, Anna, I think you might be the closest to how he wants to use it. It's sucking this spiritual life out of something that should actually be whole and is way more compelling when it is whole. And then he uses these two examples to illustrate how desecration so easily happens. The first example he uses of desecration is professional clergy. And so I know there are, at least, if some of you are carrying around credentials that I'm not aware of, forgive me, but I know Monique and I, this hits particularly close to home. How does he describe the desecration that happens when we talk about professional clergy?
I think the desecration is what happens to the rest of us. He says that
Mm.
religion has to become this part-time thing for the rest of us that we have to squeeze in around our real work. And it sounds to me like that change that happens to the rest of us, making faith just this add-on with our time, is the real desecration.
Mm. Okay, and so, so school teacher, just to use an example, well, that's not actually serving God, that your idea, that's just your regular job. And then you got to serve God sort of with whatever time is left. Does that kind of describe what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what it seemed to me like he
Okay.
was trying to say, that, if someone is paid full time to be a preacher and a minister, they're doing ministry,
Mm.
and then the rest of us are not, with most of our waking hours.
Yep.
Yeah, which is false.
Right.
Does that definition sound true to you all? How as he's talking about it, or did you read this professional clergy part differently?
I don't know.
Oh, I'm hearing whispers.
Well, is he saying that you're just supposed to be a professional pastor, clergy, and that's what you get paid to do? You're not supposed to be in 4-H or a farmer or play hockey? I mean, is that what he was saying? Because I didn't get to read it, but is that what he's? I don't know.
I'll offer that to everyone else first.
Okay. Because what I'm seeing here is you're doing clergy as your living, but you're a family man, a husband, a father, you're a farmer, you're a human being like all the rest of us. You have a life beyond the church. Everybody has a life beyond their job.
Yeah, I would say that one of the criticisms around the professionalization of clergy is kind of exactly what Kevin was saying, that as clergy, we can go and do those things. And often, actually, those things are considered part of us, who we are as clergy.
Mm-hmm.
But the flip side, in the laity, spirituality is one, is Sunday. This is I think what Barry's saying and critiquing it is your spirituality is a section of your life, like part of the pie. Whereas when we're as professional clergy, and I'm very critical of, and I don't know that. Yeah, I'm very critical of the whole concept of professional clergy, despite the fact that I am a professional clergy person.
I have a lot to say about it too. So
yeah,
yeah.
Where we are kind of seen as the experts of it, because it's like, why are we the experts of it? We have, most of the time, we have people around us who have much more expertise. Mm-hmm. In it. So it's the divide between laity and clergy, and I think it becomes then we become a employee or a product of the church. So that's challenging, right? Yeah. And we become increasingly more. I realize I'm speaking, Sam, to your church community, so we need to feed ourselves, but there are clergy people who are making a lot of money as a percentage of a church budget, right?
Mm-hmm. Shh. Don't say it too loud. Yeah, and so this, and that's very well said. So yeah, this first idea that we desecrate by saying whatever it is that you non-professional clergy are doing isn't spiritual, is a way that we minimize and desecrate the goodness of God that is already present in you. Whatever it is you are doing, however it is you make a life for yourself, is fully and completely full-time ministry. We just simply don't discuss it as much. And if it is full-time ministry, then we need to look at it with moral eyes. and to always be asking ourselves, how is my faith informing the ways that I go about my life? How is my relationship to the Creator affecting how I am interacting with creation? And then there's the second thing he uses, and Dot, this is your thing, where he talks about students for ministry going to rural settings. And so, how is that, as he describes it? How does he describe that as a desecration? Where is the desecration in sending students for ministry to rural parishes and then generally having them go elsewhere? What is being desecrated, and how does it desecrate?
Well, I think in that scenario, he brings it out. What it leaves these churches with is there's no continuity. It's forever changing. They've got the young ones coming in, completing their work, whatever, and then moving on to something bigger and better. So he's implying that the rural church is not enough for, let's say, the career of a pastor, that they need to move up and go someplace else, to go to a bigger church or into the cities in order to do work. And I just found that all completely not the way I think. It may have been his experience in his area, but I think, I mean, St. Mary's is a great example. And we've had so many pastors that have been here for, that have had long terms here. I wouldn't want to live in a city. And I'm sure there's plenty of pastors that don't want to live in a city. There's nothing more sacred about serving a parish in a city than it is about serving one in the rural community. So.
Yeah, I found that difficult also. Vicki and I read it together, and I just felt like he was kind of bashing the rural pastures. I don't know, and it was hard for me to understand where he was going with that. And that was towards the end, I guess, wasn't it? And I had a hard time with that. I don't know.
Yes,
So-
because I was reading. Oh,
Sorry.
me.
Go ahead, Dot. Sorry about that.
Go ahead,
No,
Dot.
As I was reading it to Steve, before I got to the one paragraph, I said, well, it sounds like he thinks all ministers should be country ministers or stay in the country. But then there's a sentence there, it says, not all ministers should be country ministers, just as not all people should be country people. So then I was confused what he was trying to say, but for some reason, I felt too, I was like, Tommy, I felt that he was saying, I just don't think it would work if everybody stayed in the country rural church, because we need people in churches everywhere other than the country. But I thought too he was being critical, but I feel he's being critical about the organization, as the church as an organization, as an organized institution. Even though in his background, I was trying to find out what his background was. And when I did look it up, I found out that most of his life, he did not attend a local church, but he has, in his later life, has attended a church regularly. But he still is and wherever I looked this up, he's still very suspicious of most organized, not suspicious, I guess maybe that's not the right word, even though that's the word somebody used, of the organized church, of the organized church. So it left me with a lot of questions, I guess, because you look at a church like St. Mary's, which is, some of us here have been there for a while, and that church has been there as a organized church a long time, very long time.
1762.
Yeah. And so, but I'm also looking how that church has grown in my short time in comparison to the hundreds of years that it's been there. The church as a people in serving and loving others and doing more for the community and spreading out. So I think the church does evolve as we learn, but I don't take it as being, I guess I just didn't look at it until I read this from Barry as being so critical that it, rural church, organized church, I don't know. I just felt it was a little pessimistic or critical of the organized church. I don't know.
See, this is so interesting, and I want to keep moving along. I want to be respectful of time, but I have heard this very sentiment said by seminarians. Like it is, and what I might remind the folks at St. Mary is how much you are an exception to this rule. That I remember, and I might have told this from the pulpit. I don't quite remember because COVID has turned my brain into mush. But I remember sitting at Gettysburg Seminary, sitting in lunch with the seniors who are about to get placed, and that's how it works in the Lutheran system. You get assigned to a region. And there was a student who sat across the table from me. I can see her as sure as you are sitting on my screen right now. And she says to me, I'm probably going to end up in a rural church, and God, I hope I get out of there in 3 years or so because I want to go somewhere else. And I just looked at her, and I was like, you do realize those are my people. like those, that's my grandmother, that's my grandfather, that's my parents, that's my kids. Those are my friends. Like, what? Forgive me, what the hell are you talking about? Like, I remember having that kind of reaction to it. But in the wider system, I invite you to sort of step out of your local parish for a second and realize that in wider systems, this is very often what happens. When I was at a previous call, we were part of a union church. That union church could not pay a full-time minister, and so they would send students who would do a year. And they would come, do about 9 months, and then leave. And they would sing the next person in 9 months, and then they would leave. And there was this constant rotating door, which on one hand serves this idea of like, you know, the church had a need, the student had a need, and together, you know, they came together. But this happens a lot. And what happens is that young students will come, they gain some experience, they gain money, they gain all of this, and then they take that and go. That is extractive. Like I told you I had some strong feelings about this. That sentiment of I want my career to move forward, and therefore I want to go to better places. And Vicki, you used that word better. I know you used it facetiously, but there very much is a sense of going to a better place. That very much is part of the conversation around clergy at times. And so that is extractive. And it's extractive of rural communities. And he says, I mean, the best line to describe this is the soul of the plowboy ain't worth as much as the soul of the delivery.
Yes.
The soul of the soul of the Hispanic farm worker apparently is not worth as much as the soul of the Uber driver. That really does happen, and it desecrates saying that there are some lives are more valuable than others because they're more economically beneficial than others, and we have not wrestled with that enough. I do think it's okay to say, yeah, not everybody should be a country pastor. That's not what he's saying, just as not everybody should be country people. Like, we do not need more people rolling up into rural areas, buying up large plots of land, and then thinking they know how to farm. That's not what we need. That is destructive. But we need to value the things that are rural for what they contribute as they are. Sorry, I feel very strongly about this. I'm preaching now. So I'm going to stop and I invite you to reflect on that story. I have heard this said, and it drives me crazy.
Yeah. So, Vicki, just one of the things, I think Barry is not criticizing the rural pastor. I think Barry is rightly criticizing a system in which the rural pastor is not respected in the college of clergy. And so here in our diocese, one of the first things I heard when I went to my when I went to CARP was, well, you'll do your time. And so
yes,
until we get to a point, and there is in the College of Clergy, there is a cultural judgment and why would you want to stay in the rural church? And what happens to rural parishioners is when you get that fluctuation, then all of a sudden you're looked bad upon by the system when they say, well, why aren't you doing that well? Well, how well are you going to do when you've got a student clergy person coming in and out every 12 months? I'm not suggesting that you don't, if you have had long pastorates, that is the exception often in the rural church. You do need some continuity to create community. It takes time or to support. Anyways, I could
yeah, we could do a whole thing on this.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
But I feel like that goes back to the whole economy piece that we were just talking about. I mean, when you talk about how certain rural churches can't afford a full-time minister, so they get sort of the trainees. It's like, well, what message is that sending to the church itself, that you don't have enough money, so we're not gonna give you somebody full term to create that consistency because you don't have the money, but yet we don't want you to focus solely on the money. We want you to focus on, I mean, it's just hypocritical.
But you can't buy, Christy, the best priest. It is all economy. It's all professional, unless,
No. And yeah, Christy, well done. Just sort of illustrating how this desecrates and how so much of what we assume as institutional culture is actually informed by the values that we hold of our economy, which we have not talked enough about in the context of faith. We have not talked about how often they are extractive. To go all the way back to week 1, we have not talked about how industrial they are and how there's there might be a different way of us doing faith together that is more life-giving, not just to our people, but also to our clergy and to our land and all the things we've talked about over the last 6 weeks. And so I'm going to push this, if I can push this like 10, 15 minutes more, because we have to get to the Bible and we have to get to this idea. So he wants to put all this back together. And he says, underneath, like we've been doing all this stuff, but there is actually a different paradigm, is what he's trying to say. And he pulls it from Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. Let's do a little bit of Bible in this, shall we? And so he uses this verse, which can go in a variety of different ways, but I will read it to you. He puts it in here. But it's in the first creation account in Genesis 1, says, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. And so how has this been read? And we've discussed this a couple of times, so I just want to touch on it and then keep going. How has this been read to lean into extractive ways of being? And how might we actually reimagine this to lean into more life-giving ways of being? So how has this been read poorly and in ways that are extractive or industrial?
Well, it's the whole subdue, what does that mean?
Exactly.
Does it mean that the animals and the land are below us in some way? We are superior to them.
Yeah, so I wanted to take that and just kind of pull this idea of, well, dominion means domination, which is not the same thing, but we often read it as such. He suggests there's a different way to read this. How does Barry understand this verse in a more life-giving way?
You have to read that.
Well, he's saying that if, we have to think about it from like that he goes on to say, well, we're caretakers. And if we're caretaking God's land, like how could this possibly be?
Mm-hmm.
I just have a really quick question.
Sure.
Do people actually use this verse as a way of justifying like things? Like he's saying here? Like, do people stand on the pulpit?
Because I see Anna's head bobbing up and down like crazy.
And say
I've definitely been in experiences. I've been in conversations and situations where people use that a lot to basically crush anybody who's talking about environmentalism things, because they're like, the world is ours to use. I mean, and do whatever we want.
The world is ours to use, and it's going to burn anyway.
Yeah, so just do whatever.
Wow. I was, this was shocking to me. Because I've never heard anyone use it like that. So I was like, thank you for sharing. I figured people here had stories of how that was used, but wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've been shocked too. So when I've been in those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he says in the middle of 98, he says, the ecological teaching of the Bible is simply inescapable. God made the world because he wanted it made. That right off the bat is such a different paradigm. That got, like the idea that God has emotion, first of all, and God desired something. God wanted there to be a thing. God made the world because, and Barry uses the masculine terms here, so allow me simply to quote, God made the world because he wanted it made. He thinks the world is good and he loves it. It is his world. He has never relinquished title to it, and he has never revoked the conditions bearing on his gift to us of the use of it that oblige us to take excellent care of it. And so this idea of domination, yes, there is a role for us to play, but this verse, which has so often been used to emphasize domination, is actually just saying, hey, listen, because it starts with God blessed them. It doesn't say with God just handed it over and said, have fun. It says God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. There is a sense in which we serve a fertility God. Like the idea of fruitfulness and multiplication is a positive thing. The more life, the more God is honored in all of that. And it's a totally different way of reading this than it has traditionally been read. And then, Abby, you lead us into this conversation, and this is sort of where we'll land this discussion. And I'm going to try to pronounce it right. Usufruct, okay? And if that didn't come across right on Zoom, forgive me. But I'm telling you, Google tells me that's how to pronounce it. Usufruct, okay? This isn't awkward at all. And so, did anybody look this up, or what is a definition of this word? It is a legal term. What does usufruct mean?
I did look it up.
Thank you.
And it's the right to enjoy the use and advantages of another's property, short of destruction or waste of its substance. To enjoy, to use, to rent, but not to destroy.
And so how does that change how we think about church? Let's land this plane on church. If we were to practice this fundamental principle of this idea that we are enabled to use, but not to the point of destroying, because ultimately we don't own it. Like there's this lack of ownership. What would that look like in terms of how might we practice this in terms not just of a church as an institution, whether it's the local church or the wider churches that we serve, these larger institutions, but also the communities in which we serve and the land on which we find ourselves? What kind of practices would we do?
That's another whole session.
Well, let's do it real quick.
in our church, one of our practices is we acknowledge the indigenous land that before every service, and
for every service.
Yes, at the beginning of every service, we acknowledge our land and we acknowledge that we are only stewards and not owners.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So there are liturgical ways of. Just by saying something out loud, you start to acknowledge a wider history and a wider story and a wider reality that's bigger than just you or who happens to be here at the moment. Other things.
Well, I was just going to say that lack of ownership thing seems so critical for me. And I think just thinking about my own parish, I think that would be a really challenging thing for people to wrap their heads around, because I hear so much of this kind of language of my church. This is how we've always done things. This is what I want for my church. And that the whole concept of not thinking about any of it as ours, not only the land that it's built on, but even the structures, the cultures that we've built in the church, to not think of any of it as ours, but all of it coming to us as a gift. And something that then we have a responsibility to hand on into the future. I think just just wrapping our heads around that would be a huge thing for my church. And then I said my church.
You said-
Whoops.
You're the best, Kevin.
No, he's back by shame.
So the question that I want to end with, we have tried to show, or Barry has tried to show, how the realities of our economy around us, these industrial ideas that we've been talking about for a while, he's trying to illustrate how they find their way from the economy into the church along with our tithes. Like, because we depend on that system. So we don't just get money, we also get virtue and we get value that sort of flows into the church, and it can infect, or it can change the way that we think about things. So my question to you, my final question, I asked you this in the email, is how might we reverse that and think about how we might actually let our virtues and our values flow back out into our economies, rather than always absorbing how the world sees things and trying to do church the way the rest of the world does it? How might we take some of these ideas of worshiping the Creator, honoring the creation, maybe a lack of ownership, or loosening our hands a little bit to ownership? How might churches support and challenge landowners, farmers, the people who find themselves around us? Because I hear that regularly as a pastor, like, farmers always saying to me, like, why doesn't the church care about us? And so how might we show care, but also invite other people into thinking more creatively about their work and bringing their work into a fuller understanding of faith? I know that's a huge question, but that's sort of where I want to land, is that churches should have something to say to farmers and to say to our larger community. What are some things that we might offer back as we bring our study to a close? I'm going to have to do another study, aren't I?
Yeah. You cannot ask that question with, a few minutes left.
I know, but I have to.
The whole point of this entire experience.
Yeah. I have to, though. I have to ask the question.
Are you asking, Sam, something as simple as local farmers, if we would go out, just reach out to them and say, can you contribute a bushel of tomatoes? Or can you contribute so much of your corn, providing it's sweet corn? Or like what you plant, can you donate some to the church for the people of the community? I don't know. I'm not quite sure.
I actually would say the complete opposite, because I know that already happens. Like, there's a lot of that.
For them.
But what I'm saying is that that's often what we do. We go to people around us and say, what can you contribute? We ask resources to flow back into the church. And we forget that we are enabled with we have an institution, we have resources, we have virtues and values that we can actually, to use an industrial term, we can actually export out. And that is what we actually do a really poor job of. Is, we ask and ask and ask. And in that way, the church can be extractive on the communities that we serve. Like, what I'm saying is, what if we went to the farmers and say, hey, at the beginning of the season, can we come bless your fields?
Okay.
Like, can we just say that what you're doing is not separate from your faith, but actually is a really integral part of what it means, not only to live your faith, but to live into the larger kingdom of God that God is bringing to bear, a kingdom where all things find life and life more abundant? Like, can we just start by saying, we see your fields and we hope it's a good year for you? Like, that's energy that flows the other way. It's not asking things always back into the church, but it's sending stuff out in a positive way, sending our gifts out to them. Abby, I saw you sort of flick your hand.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting, because I think this is, applies on many levels, not just in the context we're talking here today, but like when you go to someone and you say, what can we do for you, as opposed to assuming what is needed, like, what can our church community offer you, whether it's like in the beginning of the harvest or things like that, like, what can we do because we value you, and let them tell their story of what could be useful. Mm-hmm. And then see what we can do. Yeah.
Or even invite them into our community of the church.
Yeah.
Because maybe they haven't been invited.
Exactly. Christy, I see your hand.
I was thinking this along the same lines as Abby. I mean, weeks ago we talked about how at the very beginning of all this, how farmers in rural areas sometimes feel isolated and, you know, sort of left to their own defenses. So I think making sure that people see the church as a safe place and as a safe space for them to come and not just worship, but get assistance or counsel and just a place to feel valued and appreciated would go a long way. And making sure that, you know, that they know that we're here for them and that this is a safe space and how can we help. And even if it's volunteering to help with a harvest, I mean, it's just making sure that the church is inclusive of everyone.
So. One of the things that we did in our rural churches during the harvest time, like when couples are exhausted, what about just offering a babysitting night? You don't have to come to the church. You don't have to do anything, but we know you're tired, and we'll have a night where you can drop the kids off and go out for dinner. We've even served dinner for couples. We don't talk anything about church. Yeah. Just give us the kids and here's dinner, or take dinner to them, to the farm.
Yeah, and so my hope as we come to the end of our time is that sort of what I want for the St. Mary's community, and each of you who are in a different community can use this information that we've discussed in whatever way you want, but my hope for the St. Mary's community is that we would always and everywhere take seriously and rejoice in the fact that we get to be a rural church, and that it is an extraordinary and remarkable call that we have. Particularly as the world keeps telling us that rural churches are dying, rural communities are dying, and that doesn't make it not true, but that pessimism that I think I hear you all reading in Barry, like I think actually comes more regularly from the world, saying you have so little to offer, that you are always going to struggle. You're not in a populous area, and therefore you have very little to offer. And what Barry says at the end is like, actually, there's a remnant. And I'm so grateful to be in a community that has resources and has energy and has a perspective on faith that we can actually reimagine and wrap our arms around being an authentic rural church, not just a church that happens to be in a rural community, but is trying to do church like everybody else down the street, like to take seriously the place where we are, to criticize ourselves sometimes, to say, wait a second, we've absorbed some things that maybe haven't been helpful or useful for us, and reimagine ways of being creative in the space where we actually are. Because in a world of climate change, in a world of COVID, in a world of race relations, in a world of name your crisis that we're going through right now, rural churches have something really unique to offer. That we actually have experiences that come from being so close to the land that don't make us better than others, but it does mean we have a very unique offering to contribute. And that is what I've committed my vocational ministry to, is constantly saying to rural churches, we don't just want your voice at the table, we need your voice at the table as an authentic rural church, not just a rural church trying to do industrialized church or church, or programming church or anything like that. So I hope that you come out of this study feeling a little bit challenged, because Barry does kind of want to poke us in the ribs sometimes, and I'm okay with that. I think that's good pastoring. Barry's not a pastor, but I don't mind letting him do the talking so I don't have to. But I hope you feel a little bit challenged and also a little bit encouraged that wherever you are, you and your faith community have something really important to offer. Go discover that and then offer it. And in that, we'll get this much closer to the kingdom of God. Again, a place where there is life, and there is life more abundant, not just for you and for me, but for literally everything that God has made. And that's what gets me out of bed every morning. And that is why I've really enjoyed sharing this study with you all. So I will give any last words to you all before we conclude for today. I'm a little bit over. Forgive me for that. But you knew that. By week 6, if you haven't figured that out, that's your problem. So, last thoughts.
I just want to say thank you.
Yes.
For letting
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Oh,
Good.
thank you. And
Thank
we
you,
will
Stan.
we will look to reconvene. We'll do one of Barry's novels. I will email you out. Again, if you guys want to do that, that's great. If you don't, that's fine too. Just we didn't really get to any of his novels, which are some of his best work. And so, but I feel like we need to handle the novels as a whole. So I didn't want to bust them up and try to make sense of it without reading the whole thing. So we'll come back later and do that. But in the meantime, I'm gonna put everything out the way that we have been so we can continue the conversation. I might also ask you to reflect a little bit on this time and help me get better at what I do. I would love to keep the lunchtime sessions going and maybe read some people that are really important to you all, and just keep this conversation going. So I want to make sure that that continues to happen. So if you could email me back once I email you out, I'd be grateful for that. And Vicki, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I would just like to say that it was a real pleasure to meet so many different people from all around. So I really appreciate everybody who joined in and different perspectives.
Yeah.
And I'd like to say something to Anna. We send blessings to her for the wonderful work that she's doing. I admire you. I admire you for what you're doing.
Thank you, guys. It's been really cool to be a part of this. I've really enjoyed it on my time.
We got to get you and Nathan to come speak, virtually or otherwise.
That would be nice.
No. All right, y'all. Well, thank you so much again for your time, and I pray you have a great rest of the day, and we'll be in touch.
I just have one little memory from today, and it's a little bit of a joke, but it's been sticking in my head. You know, without a royal pig farmer pastor as Sam, the big city pastors will never be able to order pork medallions a la wine sauce in the city.
And with that, we are going to say goodbye. Thank you so much,
Michelle,
y'all.
if you ever want to come to Canada, you can come to my church. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.